The wind whistled as if trying to rip every trace of heat from the skin. The base was plunged into the heavy silence of a polar dawn, where the simple act of breathing felt like a struggle against invisible blades slicing through the air. It was the kind of night where every step outside the metal walls meant facing a relentless enemy, the absolute cold. Outside, the thermometer registered temperatures that would make steel stiffen and crack. Inside the control room, the air was thick with fatigue and tension. Everyone knew this was the worst shift of the week, not just because of the time or the weather, but because the wind was coming from the north, bringing low clouds and a strange sensation that the ice was more alive than it should be. And it was precisely at that moment that the commander announced her name. There was no drawing of lots, no fair rotation. The choice was direct and charged with intention. "You take the dawn exterior shift," he said without meeting her eyes. The silence that followed was cut by a muffled laugh from a corner of the room. It wasn't a laugh of amusement, but of contempt. Some exchanged knowing glances, as if they'd just witnessed a small act of revenge being carried out. To them, she was just the new kid, the one who hadn't earned the right to complain, the one whose presence was still seen as a casualty of scale. As she pulled on her heavy thermal jacket and adjusted her gloves, she could feel every glance boring into her back. They weren't looks of concern or encouragement. They were silent judgments, some carrying the cruel pleasure of seeing someone put in their place. The low murmur of voices behind her sounded like a chorus of disapproval. Whispered words escaped the air, and even without hearing clearly, she knew what they were saying. "Let's see if you can handle it. This will teach you. I doubt you'll last until dawn." Outside, the darkness was almost solid. The dim light of the spotlight was lost within a few meters, swallowed by the mist of ice crystals carried by the wind. Every step she took seemed to echo through her body, as if the harshness of the cold was turning bones and muscles to stone. The radio clipped to the side of her jacket crackled with interference, a constant reminder that if something went wrong, communication would not be easy. However, it wasn't the weather or the isolation that weighed most heavily on her at that moment. It was the knowledge that they were testing not only her physical endurance, but also her mind, her ability to withstand not only the cold, but also the calculated indifference of those who expected her to fail. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted her hood and advanced along the narrow steel walkway that led to the base's exterior. The wind picked up, pushing her sideways as if to remind her that she didn't belong here. The base lights faded, and with each step, the metallic sound of her boots against the structure mingled with the distant roar of the wind. Ahead, only darkness and the stark white of the ice with no promise of welcome. As she walked, flashes of memories flashed through her mind. The day she arrived, the cold handshake, the quick, impersonal instructions. No one had asked why she was there. No one seemed interested in knowing her story. She had learned quickly that in this environment, respect wasn't asked for. It was earned, and always through the hardest of paths. When she finally reached the designated lookout point, the scene was even more oppressive. The ice stretched out like an endless plain, interrupted only by jagged blocks that stood like ancient sentinels. The sky, shrouded in thick clouds, reflected a pale light that seemed more like a sigh from the moon. The silence was so intense that every slightest noise became a screaming presence, and it was there, in that emptiness, that she realized she was truly alone. The sensation was twofold, a mixture of vulnerability and a strange clarity. Out here, the intrigues, the glances, the words thrown into the shadows didn't matter. The only judge was the environment itself, and it was unforgiving. But still, deep in her chest, something pulsed differently. It wasn't just fear or resignation. It was an almost imperceptible force, like an ember that stays lit even under the snow, waiting for the right moment to ignite. And maybe that was exactly what no one in there could see, that by giving her the coldest shift of the night, they weren't just trying to break her, they were unintentionally giving her the perfect opportunity to prove she belonged there. If you're feeling the tension of this story and want to follow every twist and turn until the moment everything changes, watch this video now and subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. And have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to bring you down and unintentionally gave you the chance to transform yourself? The cold didn't just touch the skin, it penetrated layers, seeped into bones, stealing heat from within. There was no respite, no mercy. The biting wind tore at the face like invisible blades, bringing with it ice crystals that accumulated on the eyelashes, making every blink difficult. The snow didn't fall gently. It came in horizontal gusts, pushed by the fury of the dawn, covering footprints almost as soon as they were left. All around only darkness. Not ordinary darkness, but the kind that blends with absolute white, creating a visual nothingness where the eye becomes lost. The loneliness was almost tangible. The knowledge that behind the base's thick walls, everyone was fast asleep while she remained there, exposed to the icy abyss, weighed more heavily than the equipment she carried. There was no laughter, no voices, no sign of human life, only the sound of her own heartbeat and the constant howl of the wind. It was like being in an abandoned world where every shadow could be something or nothing. Time seemed to stretch cruelly. Minutes turned into hours. The mind, deprived of stimuli, began to create ghosts in the corners of its vision, shapes shaped by the shifting snow. The feeling of being watched grew, not by visible enemies, but by the vastness of the environment itself, as if the ice were a living, silent being, witnessing every step. The thick gloves didn't stop the burning of the fingers, alternating between pain and numbness. The breath condensed inside the mask, moistening and freezing simultaneously, creating a cold film on the lips. The radio clipped to the vest remained silent, and this absence of human sound was both a relief and a psychological burden. There was no one to break the isolation, but there was also no one to offer immediate support. And in this absence, the mind began to question, why me? Why me here now when everyone else was protected, warm, unaware of the silent struggle taking place at this very moment? It was a mixture of wounded pride and survival instinct. Pride, because she knew she had been placed there not by trust but by disbelief, a veiled proof that few believed in her resilience. Instinct, because despite this, every fiber of her body screamed not to fail, to resist, to show that, even alone, she could overcome what few would dare face. The cold wasn't just a physical threat. It was a constant voice trying to convince her mind to give up. It whispered that it would be easier to give in, that no one would know if she retreated. But in the icy silence, there was also an inner flame, small but inextinguishable, that said, keep going. The forced isolation had a curious effect. It heightened her self-awareness. Her own thoughts echoed louder. Each heartbeat sounded like a distant drum, and her rhythmic breathing became almost an involuntary mantra. She became simultaneously the sentinel and the prisoner of that shift, defying the solitude and the weather as if they were invisible but implacable enemies. With each step, the ice crunched beneath her boots, a harsh, almost comforting sound, for it signified movement, and movement signified warmth, life, presence. Her body, however, was beginning to feel heavy. The cold has a treacherous way of stealing energy without us even realizing it. It's not a sudden blow, but a gradual drain, a subtle invitation to exhaustion. And it's at this moment that solitude proves most dangerous, when the weary mind begins to imagine that no one would notice if she simply stopped. But there was something stronger than the cold and the loneliness, the need to prove herself capable, to show those who underestimated her that they'd chosen the wrong person to test. And so, with the snow beating against her face and the night dragging slowly on, she continued, each step an act of defiance, each breath a reminder that she was there for a reason. If it were you, would you have the courage to face this icy solitude until dawn? The silence was so dense, it seemed weighted, filling every crevice of air as if trying to suffocate all thought. No footsteps, no audible breathing other than one's own, which grew ever slower and more controlled, as if the body instinctively tried to camouflage itself in the soundless void. It was the kind of silence that isn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of something invisible, something watching and waiting. The space around seemed amplified, as if every inch of ground, every particle suspended in the air, were suspended in time. It was then, amidst this absolute emptiness, that it happened. A deep, almost imperceptible crack reverberated in the distance. It wasn't loud, it wasn't insistent, but it was enough to shatter the tense tranquility that enveloped everything. The sound wasn't accompanied by wind or echo, but it carried its own weight as if it were a disguised warning. It was the kind of noise that would go unnoticed by the average person, but to those familiar with the fragility of structures and the unpredictable behavior of nature, it would sound like a silent alarm. The trained ear cannot ignore it. It's a sound that demands respect because it doesn't scream, only insinuates. The short, low vibrations touched the skin before the mind could even process what had happened. The sensation was like feeling the ground pulse for an instant, a whisper coming from the bowels of the earth or the depths of the ice. Instinct awakened immediately, without asking reason for permission. The spine stiffened, the shoulders hunched forward, and the eyes searched the gloom for a source for what their ears had picked up. There was no wind to blame, no animal to justify, and the absence of any movement on the horizon only made the scene more unsettling. This kind of sound, muffled and precise, doesn't come by chance. It was as if the ice had spoken its own language, a language few understand, but which those who depend on it for survival recognize as a harbinger. A crack can mean change, displacement, rupture. And nature, when it decides to move, doesn't ask permission. The mind then began cataloguing possibilities in seconds, with the speed of someone who has learned that every detail can decide between safety and disaster. The heart raced, not out of pure fear but out of alert. The body knew it needed to react even before understanding why. It was as if all the stories heard over the years about slaps before falls, before ruptures, before the inevitable, were now condensed into that single moment. The sound lingered in the memory like a sonic scar, mentally replaying itself so as not to be forgotten. The gaze scanned the frozen ground, searching for cracks, marks, any visible sign that the ice was giving way. But real danger, the one only the experienced perceive, rarely shows itself immediately. It hides beneath layers, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And in that instant, even without concrete proof, something inside her told her the moment was closer than she'd hoped. Her breathing became shallower, measured not from lack of air, but from an unconscious attempt to hear better, as if the silence around her could be even deeper if she became part of it. No further noise came to confirm or deny, but instinct had already marked her position, mentally recording the direction and approximate distance of the sound. It was as if her entire body had become a single ear, picking up nuances, waiting for the next signal. Because on the ice nothing happens only once. The first voice is always followed by a second, and those who ignore the first rarely hear the last. And it was there at that precise point between tension and uncertainty that she knew she had to decide whether to remain still, analyzing, or move before the second voice arrived. The sound no one else heard had already chosen its listener, and somehow it seemed to have done so on purpose. Would you dare investigate, or would you just stand there waiting for the next sound? The wind sliced at her face like invisible blades, each gust carrying with it a deep echo, a murmur from deep within the ice. She paused for a moment, eyes half closed, not just to shield herself from the snow whipping her face, but to listen. It wasn't the usual sound of ice sheets expanding in the cold, that muffled crack any newcomer to the base would learn to ignore. It was something different, deeper, deeper, a sound that seemed to come from beneath her feet, as if the earth were holding its breath. Her instincts, honed by years of close observation and experience few there believed she possessed, went off like a silent alarm. While the others would keep their pace brisk and their attention focused solely on what lay ahead, she knew that looking down could be the difference between making it back alive or being swallowed by the icy void. Each step he took seemed to make the ground murmur in response. The ice vibrated beneath the soles of his boots, not perceptible to the ordinary senses, but like a tension that coursed through the body of those who knew how to listen. She remembered the stories that circulated among veterans, not the ones told in manuals, but the ones whispered in their ears, about missions that never made it into official reports, about people who vanished without a trace when the ice decided to open. What she was hearing now sounded exactly like the accounts that had previously seemed exaggerated. The difference was that this time it wasn't a distant legend. It was happening right before her. The air seemed denser. The clouds above swirled slowly, and the dawn light cast a metallic reflection on the white surface, as if the ice were a vast mirror ready to shatter into shards. She adjusted the weight of her backpack, but didn't quicken her pace. Running would be a fatal mistake. When the ice is under stress, every impact is like an invitation for it to give way. She maintained her balance, distributing her weight precisely, as if walking on glass. The sounds came in irregular intervals, now a sharp crack, now a dull, prolonged thud, vibrating the air. It was like listening to a giant's heartbeat about to collapse. Her mind worked silently but quickly. With each meter she advanced, she mentally mapped out possible escape routes. She observed small, almost imperceptible cracks branching out beneath the snow. They were thin lines, like bluish veins running beneath the translucent skin of the ice. To the naked eye, nothing alarming. To her, they were clear signs that the structure was giving way. And when the ice decides to break, it doesn't give a second thought. The rupture can be sudden, and the sound that precedes it is exactly the one she was hearing now. She thought of the others at the base, warm and confident that nothing could happen so close to the secure perimeter. She thought of the looks of contempt when she questioned the area's security. She thought of the times she'd been treated as overreacting. But in that moment, none of those judgments mattered. What lay before her wasn't about wounded pride or belated recognition. It was about survival. And in a way about proving, if only to herself, that her reading of danger had always been accurate. She took a deep breath, trying to synchronize her heartbeat with the rhythm of the sounds. She wanted to feel the exact moment when the crack stopped being just a warning and became the breaking point. Every muscle was alert, every fiber ready to react at the right moment. She knew that if she retreated too quickly, she could generate dangerous vibrations. If she delayed too much, it would be too late. The balance between action and waiting had never been so deadly. The wind shifted, and with it came a different sound, no longer a crack, but a low, drawn-out moan that seemed to rise from the depths. It was the sound of entire slabs shifting beneath the surface, a slow but inevitable movement. She looked around and saw, a few meters away, a spot where the snow seemed softer, newer. That was where the danger lay. That was where the ice, pressed by unseen forces, was about to split. Her eyes fixed on the spot, and in that instant, everything around her lost importance. There was no cold, no wind, no one else. Just her, the ice, and the choice she would have to make in the next few seconds. Recognizing danger wasn't just a technical skill, it was a silent pact with her own life, seeing what others didn't see, feeling what others didn't feel, and acting when everyone still thought it was too soon. Have you ever had a moment where you noticed a danger before everyone else around you? The wind sliced through the freezing night, and she felt the pressure of time building like a weight on her shoulders. Every second that passed felt like an eternity in which everything could be lost. She knew her mission was risky, but urgency drove her forward. The radio crackled with erratic communication, but still the orders were clear. Find the source of the problem. Be quick. We can't wait. What was happening there in that isolated base in the middle of the ice? What had she seen, or rather, what had she not yet seen? She felt a chill run down her spine. Instinct told her to run to safety and alert the others, but something inside her told her not to just run. Something was wrong, very wrong. She could lose everything in the blink of an eye. The decision had to be made there, right now. She gazed at the endless white horizon. The base was surrounded by mountains of ice, and the sound of the wind seemed to swallow any sound that tried to impose itself. Each step she took was like an invitation into the unknown. The messages were clear, but the information fragmented. With each new piece of information, more questions arose. What was about to happen here, and how could she alone prevent the approaching disaster? The radio emitted a distorted sound again, and she pressed the button hard, hoping to hear something that made sense. But there was no more time to wait for answers. Her mind was a mess, but one thing was clear. If she didn't make a decision now, it would be too late. She couldn't ignore what was happening. She had to act. Suddenly she stopped, her eyes fixed on something that had been there all along, hidden beneath the layer of ice. Something everyone had perhaps overlooked. What had seemed like a small crack in the ice now seemed like a sign, a silent warning from nature. She couldn't afford to ignore it. It was now or never. A sense of urgency gripped her, and she prepared to run toward the unknown. The dilemma still loomed over her. Should she warn everyone and wait for help, which might take too long, or investigate alone and risk being discovered in a place where no one else knew what was happening? She knew time was against her. Every second felt crucial, and her breathing was becoming more rapid. Instinct told her to run, but reason kept her alert, telling her that each decision would lead her to a final destination. Fear couldn't take hold of her. Not now. She knew there was something more behind that ice and that blizzard, something no one had imagined, something that she, with all her determination and courage, needed to uncover before it was too late. And with that thought, she took the first step toward what awaited her. With each step, the silence of the base seemed heavier. The hours seemed to slip past the clock as if time itself refused to move. And yet, she pressed on, knowing that what she was about to discover could change everything. What she did now at this crucial moment would speak volumes about her courage. It was impossible to predict what would come next, but she could no longer look back. The fear had to be faced. She could no longer wait. If you were in his shoes, what would you do? Run to warn the base or investigate alone? Comment below. Your opinion could make all the difference. The ice beneath her feet wasn't just cold, it was alive. With each step, a muffled sound rose through her boots, as if the ground itself were breathing beneath her. Micro-vibrations ran through her soles and up her legs, a sensation barely perceptible to anyone not as alert as she was. The wind, which had previously cut sideways, now came from ahead, pushing her back in gusts that seemed to test her resolve. The snow fell harder, creating a thick veil that limited her vision to a few meters. Everything around her was white and endless, but she knew the treacherous ground hid invisible fracture lines. The distinctive sound of the fissures began as a faint crack, almost mistaken for the whistling of the wind, but it grew stronger, repeating itself closer, louder, as if something were giving way just ahead. She took a deep breath, feeling the icy air burning her lungs, and adjusted her weight so as not to concentrate pressure on a single point. Her muscles were tense, ready to react to any sudden yielding. The radio strapped to her shoulder emitted only static, isolating her from the rest of the team and making that moment even more intimate with the danger. Each step was a silent pact between courage and folly. Instinct screamed for retreat, but there was something ahead that could not be ignored. In the distance, a hazy shadow appeared and disappeared with the dance of the icy mist. Perhaps it was just a displaced block of ice, or perhaps it was exactly what she was looking for. The ice cracked again, this time under her own right boot, and she held her breath. She felt the sound resonate deep within the frozen layer, as if she were walking on thin skin protecting a liquid abyss. The wind picked up even more, pelting grains of ice against her face like tiny needles, and the feeling of no return became almost palpable. She realized that every noise, every crack, wasn't a warning to stop, but a cruel reminder that she was in too deep to retreat without consequences. In that instant, between fear and determination, a question formed in her mind, not as a logical thought, but as a whisper that seemed to come from the ice itself. How far are you willing to go to avoid returning empty-handed? If it were you, would you take one more step or turn back now? She was on the edge of the precipice, but it wasn't just any abyss. The sound of the wind cut through the silence, almost as if the very foundation was dreading what would come next. The sky, a mass of thick clouds, reflected the tension in the air, as if the very atmosphere were about to shatter. Each step she took in the snow felt heavier than the last, the weight of the unknown growing with each passing second. It was a simple mission, or at least it should have been. But something was wrong. Something was moving in the ice, something she couldn't understand. She wasn't the most experienced, but there was something about her that set her apart from the others. A keen perception, an instinct that always guided her when everyone else was focused on the obvious tasks. Today, more than ever, that would be crucial. The base was silent, save for the muffled sound of her footsteps. The frost on the windows obscured what was happening outside, and the interior was filled with the smell of metal and cold. She stared at the horizon, but something caught her attention. It wasn't a clear vision, but the sensation was there. as if the ground beneath her was beginning to shift unsettlingly. Something was about to give way. She moved forward, her mind racing, but something in the air made her hesitate. The glint of metal, partially projecting into her field of vision, was unusual for the area. Something was wrong. She paused, watching, trying to pinpoint the exact spot. The risk wasn't a simple miscalculation, but something she didn't know was about to happen. Suddenly a thin crack appeared. At first it seemed insignificant, just a thin line in the surface of the ice surrounding her. But the uncomfortable silence made it clear it was no mere flaw. Her every movement seemed to amplify the slowly growing rumble, as if the very foundation were swallowing the sound of the world. The crack widened rapidly. She felt the weight of time, each second stretched to its limit, as if fate awaited her next move. She was just meters from the critical area. The base, with its metal and concrete structure, was beginning to show signs of imminent failure. But what troubled her most wasn't the crack itself, but what was trapped in the part that was beginning to give way. A structure of equipment, something that should have been safe, but now seemed stuck in a precarious position. If the base gave way at that point, everything that had been built there, everything that was about to be revealed, could be lost forever. She paused, her eyes fixed on the crack where snow was beginning to pile up around it, the pressure increasing by the second. A silent panic threatened to rise within her, but the courage she had cultivated for years wouldn't let her back down. It was then, in that moment, that the decision would be made. What would she do when the structure finally gave way? She knew it was the moment when her options would disappear. The dim daylight reflected off the ice, creating an almost surreal scene. Every inch of the base seemed frozen in time, but what was happening below was anything but static. The metal plates creaked under the pressure, and the ground seemed like an extension of the abyss, ready to swallow everything. And there, amidst that icy, undisturbed landscape, she realized that her mission was now something much bigger than she had initially imagined. It wasn't just about recovering equipment or surviving the hostile climate. It was about saving everything that was at risk. Everything she now knew was about to be destroyed. She could no longer turn back. The stuck equipment, the critical point, the growing crack, all of it was now in her hands. It was time to act, and every step she took toward the rupture felt like a choice between the risk of failure and the hope of a miracle. The decision was made, but the visual shock of the scene unfolding before her, the imminent failure, would forever remind her of what would happen there. The fear was palpable, but her determination guided her. She could not fail. What would you do if you were in her shoes? Courage or fear? Comment below. The sound of the radio cut through the silence of the base like a shard in the frigid air. Her voice, hoarse and urgent, cut through interference and signal drops, trying to contain the panic and at the same time fighting the disbelief already building on the other end. There was something in her tone that betrayed more than fear. It was conviction. But in the communications room, some looked at each other and laughed, as if it were just another exaggeration on a freezing night. One of them commented, half laughing, "The little blonde must be hearing ghosts in the ice." Others shook their heads as if tired of her stories about instincts and signals. No one else noticed. But for the few who stopped to listen carefully, there was a strange weight in the pauses of her speech, as if each second were stolen from an invisible countdown. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, and the sound mingled with a crack that, so low, sounded like a distant echo, until, without warning, the first boom came. It wasn't loud, but it was dry, deep, as if the earth had swallowed its own air. Conversations ceased. Laughter died. Eyes turned to the ceiling, the walls, any direction the vibration could come from. She repeated into the radio, now more firmly, "The ice is giving way." One of the sergeants approached the control panel, trying to locate the source of the sound, but the sensors registered nothing abnormal. Another grumbled that it must just be the wind pressure. And it was at that moment, as if nature wanted to tear apart any doubt, that the sharp sound came, a long crack, as if the entire base floor was breathing before breaking. The silence that followed was more deafening than the sound itself. At that moment, even those who were mocking felt their stomachs turn. No one needed technical confirmation to understand that she had been right from the first warning. The tension rose like a suffocating heat, contrasting with the deadly cold outside. Eyes met wordlessly, as if everyone was mentally replaying the times they'd ignored someone's instincts and the price that might now exact. One of the leaders pressed the transmitter, but hesitated for a second before speaking, aware that every order from now on would define not only the mission, but perhaps who would live to tell the tale. Outside, the wind no longer felt merely cold. It seemed complicit in something greater, a warning many had been slow to accept. And now, with each footstep on the ice resonating like a threat, everyone knew the choice was no longer whether to believe it or not. It was whether there was still time to act. Have you ever been discredited until you're proven right? The wind cut her face like invisible blades, but she didn't back down. She still felt the weight of the words she'd heard days before, when some colleagues had laughed at her presence on the team and questioned her ability to withstand the pressure of a mission in one of the most hostile places on Earth. She can't handle a shift in the freezing dawn, they'd said, as if the cold were selective, as if danger chose who to attack. But that night, amid the darkness and fog that transformed the base into a white maze, something changed. Her instincts took over, and she followed a barely perceptible sound. A distinctive crack in the ice, a whisper that something was about to happen. While the others followed procedures, she ran in the opposite direction, ignoring protocols that told her to wait for orders. On the murky horizon, the irregular glow betrayed the slowly opening fissure, precisely on the route the convoy would pass in a few minutes. If it weren't for her, the vehicles and the entire team would have been seconds away from plummeting into the frozen abyss. Her labored breathing and racing heart didn't stop her from shouting into the radio, ordering an immediate halt. At first, her voice was met with hesitation, but the urgency in her tone compelled the commander to act. The silence that followed the engine's braking was broken only by the distant sound of ice giving way, revealing that if they had continued, everyone would have been lost. The commander's look, upon realizing what had happened, needed no words. It was confirmation that she had saved not only the mission, but lives. The next day they gathered in the base's central courtyard. The wind was relentless, but everyone was there. The commander, in a firm voice, declared that her instinct and courage were crucial to everyone's survival. It wasn't just a formal acknowledgement. It was the breaking of an invisible barrier that separated true respect from mere tolerance. Looks that had once held disdain now became firm and silent, as if admitting they had misjudged. There was no applause, no euphoria, just the kind of respect that needs no explanation, born of the certainty that, when everything falls apart, you want that person by your side. And she, who had arrived there as the most fragile, was now seen as the most prepared for the unpredictable. It's curious how in a single moment everything people think they know about you can be shattered. Those who had previously avoided contact now sought her opinion, wanted to be close, perhaps trying to absorb some of the strength she had demonstrated. But she knew it wasn't just physical strength or bravery. It was sensitivity. It was listening to what the silence said. It was trusting in something that goes beyond what the eyes can see. And deep down, she understood that this kind of instinct isn't learned in training. It comes from those who have had to survive invisible battles long before stepping onto a frozen field. The weight of change was in every gesture, in every wave, in every conversation that began with an unspoken thank you. She no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, but she knew that, from then on, her every step would be watched, not with doubt, but with expectation. Because for many there, she had become the silent assurance that, even in the worst-case scenario, there was still someone capable of seeing the danger before it was too late. Have you ever experienced a moment when everything changed and people finally recognized your worth? The silence after the storm is something few can comprehend. It is in that space between chaos and calm that the true essence of who we are is revealed. There she was, alone again, no longer that discredited soldier. The weight of responsibility on her shoulders didn't shake her, for her perception of courage had irreversibly changed. The ice, with its cold and implacable immensity, now seemed merely a reflection of what she had become, someone capable of defying expectations and breaking down invisible barriers. Before setting out on her mission, everyone had doubted her. The blizzard was a perfect setting for hopelessness, a place where the weak lost their way and the strong fell. But she went beyond what anyone could have imagined. She heard the call, felt the weight of the truth buried there, in the immensity of the ice, and decided to move forward. What she did was not just a mission accomplished, it was a paradigm shift, a shattering of everything that had been said was impossible. She faced the biting wind, the snow, and the ice, and discovered that sometimes the greatest strength lies in the silence of overcoming. She knew that what was happening in that moment wasn't just about her, but about everyone she'd disbelieved. Ice always holds secrets, but not everyone has the courage to uncover them. And now she knew that this secret would be a turning point, not just for her career but for her life. She had crossed an invisible line where her perception of what was possible expanded to a new horizon. The truth is that life, like a storm, tests us. Often the silence after the storm is where the deepest reflection occurs. She stood there, staring into the emptiness of the icy expanse. But now she understood. Her journey wasn't just about overcoming external challenges, but about understanding the value of her own inner strength. As she stood there, lost in thought, she knew there was more to come. The ice, so silent and cold, wasn't just a scene of desolation. It was a field of revelations, a mirror into the soul of those brave enough to take risks and discover what else lies hidden in the depths of adversity. Now, the question remains, what will she find next? The ice, with its secrets, is far from fully revealed. What else will she discover about herself and the world around her? This journey, marked by resilience and courage, is just beginning. The truth is, we all have a bit of this soldier inside us, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. If this story touched you, like it now and subscribe so we can continue together on more journeys of overcoming. Don't miss the next video, where we'll explore more deeply the power of courage in the face of adversity. Her story is just the beginning, and yours can be too. Write in the comments, I'm ready to discover my own secret.